Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Brian. And I really appreciate the product school giving me a chance to come out tonight and talk to everybody about customer-centric products. But before we dive in, I thought I would give a little more context on myself and my background and some of the places that I've had a chance to work. Like many who ultimately made it into product management, I started out as an engineer. I actually was designing laptops for IBM and Sony in Japan. That's where all the laptops were done for the ThinkPads, actually. And then, not long after that, I found my way into product management. And I kind of never looked back. I'm super passionate about creating consumer products. I've had the chance to work at big companies, my own startup, and then more recently, some crazy startups. Most of that was in the Valley. And then more recently, I found my way to Seattle, where I am now at T-Mobile. And I'm really excited about bringing a lot of my experiences to the products that we're developing now here at T-Mobile. So when it comes to developing customer-centered products, there's actually like 3 specific areas that I think about a lot. And that's the things that I wanted to touch on tonight. The first of those is really what you hear sometimes is just get outside of the office. If you're going to understand the needs of your customer, you have to get outside the office. And be an anthropologist, be observant, put yourself in the shoes of your customers. I don't think the person who invented this was sitting in an office the whole time. He was outside looking at people in parking lots and realizing there's a need there. And maybe if I actually add that to the vehicle's feature set, it might be helpful. So it's really important that I instill this in everybody that I've talked to about product management. Another that I can't emphasize enough is user testing, user research, data collection, getting feedback from your customers. And this is something that we spent a lot of time on in the past, but actually doing as much user research, and I'll get into that as much as I can. And then lastly, and this is one I've consulted for startups and I've been in startups, and it's always a challenge as a startup, but if your customers don't know your product exists, don't know that new feature that you just created is out there or even aware of it, doesn't matter. And that's a huge challenge for a lot of startups because you don't have the big marketing budget that maybe T-Mobile has. But that's something that you really have to make your customers aware of what you're doing, and there's lots of different ways to go about doing that. So before I dive in, I'd love to really talk about T-Mobile and everything I'm doing there, but unfortunately most of what I'm doing is future facing and kind of confidential at the moment. So I'm going to go back a few years to my time at GoPro. And I think when I talk about this stuff, I like to tell a story. And as product managers, we're often storytellers. So this particular story, I think, is important because we went through a lot of challenges when I arrived at GoPro. And I think going back and talking about that and sharing those experiences and the things that we went through will help everyone here understand better what it means to really get customer-centric. So I'm sure most of the people here know what GoPro is and who GoPro is, but I always like to refresh what it was like to work at GoPro by watching a GoPro video. And unfortunately, I don't think the volume here is very good, but So that's kind of what it feels like to watch one of those videos. It's pretty crazy. So let's calm it down just a bit. Those are some pretty insane moments captured on GoPros. At the time, you know, most people knew GoPro. Most everyone thought of GoPro as an action sports camera company. It made sense, right? Millions of cameras were sold even by the time I got there, you know, all over the world. So everyone was familiar with the GoPro camera and the videos that they were sharing out. Enabling people to capture the sickest footage ever. That's where GoPro really got started. But they started to realize that they had to evolve and transform into from a capture company to a storytelling company. And they also realized that, you know, they were now getting out there to a lot more customers beyond that core demographic. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let's start kind of at the beginning. GoPro was the first to successfully commercialize the camera, but they certainly didn't invent the need to self-document the action. You know, if we go back, long before GoPro ever existed, this is kind of what people did before they were invented. And what this tells you, though, is that clearly there was a core demographic of users that wanted to self-document and capture these crazy moments. What it also tells you, though, is that it wasn't really that easy to do that. So there's an opportunity there. So people had this idea, and Nick Woodman, the founder, really tapped into that, and he understood that. If you look at this, you probably think, oh, I just captured this the other day and got it out of a magazine or something like that. Actually, this is from a book called 101 Useless Japanese Inventions that was published back in 1995. Long before smartphones ever existed and all that, but yet I'm sure we've all seen the selfie stick. So long before that, people had this desire to self-capture. So enter Nick. I mean, he was a pretty rad dude. And the idea for GoPro actually came to Nick when his previous startup had failed. He's like, man, I just need to take a break. I want to go to Indonesia on a surfing trip. You know, but when he started thinking about doing that, he realized, wait, I want to capture that. I want to capture that experience of a lifetime of going to Indonesia and surfing. So he had this strong desire to do that. But he didn't want to have to bring a professional videographer or a professional cameraman or invite all his friends just to capture that experience. And so what did he do? He actually first created a prototype. He jerry-rigged some disposable waterproof. He took a waterproof camera, some broken surfboard leashes, some rubber bands, and literally strapped that camera to his wrist. Well, many iterations later, he actually invented this. This was the very first GoPro camera. And that's kind of how it all got started. It was a 35mm waterproof wrist camera. But GoPro's come quite a way since then. Now you have 4K, super tiny 4K cameras that have digitally stabilized video. They have spherical cameras and so many accessories. You know, and so now you can capture all this crazy experience, and then even on your app, auto-edit that, you know, and share it out to your friends. So now Nick and millions of other users are capturing something that looks a little more like this. And this was a very important story for us when I got there. You know, the reason it's important is because unlike most tech companies, he didn't start with a technology and then back into some kind of product. He actually started with this desire to self-capture these moments wherever you are and share that out. He tapped into that passion that people have to self-document that experience. And then he created a product around that. And that was really the vision that drove GoPro for a very long time. In the early days, there were less than 100 people crammed into this little tiny office in Half Moon Bay. And these guys, you know, were small and they understood their customers. Hell, Nick was the customer. I mean, he was a surfer, he was a race car driver. You know, all the people working at GoPro, I mean, they were skiers, snowboarders, and then on top of that, they invited their friends and their athletes into the office to hang out with them. They were hanging out with the athletes all the time. I mean, Sean White would stop by the office, you know, all these crazy people would come by because they wanted, you know, to build the product for their customers. And so they were hanging out with their customers. They were the customer all the time. And so that worked. Everyone was in lockstep. Everyone knew what they were doing. You know, they had this kind of tribal knowledge of exactly what to do. Well, fast forward. I mean, this data is a bit outdated at this point. It was back from 2015. Well, that worked for them. It propelled them into the #1 spot, you know, as an action sports camera. But as they grew in size and as they grew in popularity, they started to attract a very different demographic outside of that core user base that was the action sports fanatics and the athletes and all that. Not only that, in a very short amount of time, GoPro grew from that 100-person office in Half Moon Bay to over 1,200 people with offices spread out all over the world. So they did an amazing job kind of understanding that initial set of users and the core needs. But when I arrived there, it was a very different story. You know, everyone was relying on the opinions of Nick and sort of that core team for everything. There wasn't any user research. There wasn't any data. They barely had any feedback from their users, but yet they had this ever-growing user base of customers that were starting to fit into some place that wasn't that core demographic. And they didn't have a process in place to capture anything. You know, I was like, wow, this is crazy. So without the data and the discipline, they also didn't know how to measure success. Something launches, a new feature launches, they added something to the camera, they don't know actually did it matter. Did customers actually care about that feature? So this was kind of mind-boggling for me because I had just came from Amazon. I mean, as you all probably know, Amazon sits on mountains of data and they're super data-driven. You know, and I was like, wow, how can we make decisions about any of this stuff? Well, I take that back. Actually, I reached out to the customer, you know, customer support team is often a great source of feedback and input. So I reached out to the customer support team. I said, hey, what is your #1 problem? What are you guys hearing about from your customers all the time? They're like, our #1 phone call is stickers. I'm like, what are you talking about? Everyone's calling us and asking us for GoPro stickers. I'm like, what? Is that the biggest problem we have right now? You know, but literally that was the #1 phone call when I got there. Yeah, I was like, well, that's not going to help me right now. It's not helpful. So here I was at the kind of the beginning of their software initiative. Nick had very big ideas. He wanted us to remove all the pain points from capture to manage to edit and sharing your content back out. You know, kind of this cycle of like, I capture something, I share it out onto YouTube, and then it gets other people excited and they want to go get a camera. That has worked pretty well for them. But he wanted to remove all the pain points in between. But the problem was, I'm having these conversations with product managers, with engineers, and with execs of like, well, my gut says this, we should absolutely do that feature. Well, this is how I use it. Why wouldn't everybody want that? You know, and that's not the kind of conversation that I wanted to be having. It was super painful. And we just realized we just couldn't make decisions this way. So we had to change what often people refer to as the HIPPO. If you don't know what that means, the highest paid person's opinion. And as you can imagine at GoPro, you probably know who that is. So it was really challenging at times to get past the HIPPO. So how did we go about changing the conversation? Well, it kind of started actually with a partnership with my UX counterpart. You know, we said, look, we got to solve this problem. We got to fix the way we're talking about this. And so we kicked off a big internal campaign, first with our own internal team, and said, we got to go out and get more research. We got to understand our users better. And we did everything we could. So we started with user research. We told our team, we said, look, we're going to get a corporate account on usertesting.com. Anything and everything we can put there, we're going to put in front of our users and start testing. We encouraged our product team and the UX team to hang out at Starbucks, do guerrilla research. If you had something you needed quick feedback on, buy them a coffee and do it. You know, any way you can, get that feedback. We started bringing people into our office on a regular basis. Eventually, we got to almost every week we had users coming through the office, sitting them down in front of our applications and our stuff. Initially with the old stuff, just to get an idea of where we're at. And then when we started building new stuff, we put that in front of them. And then we told our people, go out, you know, hang out with the people. hang out with the users where they are, and get that feedback. And so we started to spend more and more time understanding what our existing customers were saying, how they talked about things, and we started to create a set of personas. And after we started to see like, hey, these are what our demographics kind of looking like. And we started to see a trend actually. It really broke, even though there was a broader set of personas, we started hearing more and more about this new demographic, and we typically called them Tara and Brendan. And these were super helpful for everybody. The UX team and the product team, everyone's talking about, hey, this would be an awesome feature for Tara. We think this would be really perfect. We'd change it like this. Helped us prioritize our features. It helped us, talk about, is this feature really important for this person? Is it a lower priority? How big of a feature should it be? How should we talk about it to the customer? This is something that was great. And we started to really use this across everything. PRDs, all the conversations in our user stories would talk about our personas. However, this was only within our software department and our group. We're like, this isn't going to work if we're just going to talk about it within us. We got to have this broader. We needed to get the whole company aligned to a set of personas. So in collaboration with our marketing team, we started to do regular surveys. We wanted to get some kind of input, of a broader set of users, both existing customers as well as, potentially new customers. So we started doing this on a quarterly basis, asking a bunch of questions, trying to get that kind of input and feedback from and understand what our customers are saying. It helps with motivations and how they think about things, brand affinities, brand association. So we did that. And that ultimately led to a company-wide, segmentation of all our customers. And so then we created a different set of personas. A lot of them looked somewhat similar than what we had come up with, but now because it was driven by the entire company, everyone was getting behind this, even Nick himself. And now, we had a consistent way to talk about all our customers, whether we're talking about customers that use the camera, use the apps, how they walk into a store, how we deal with retail. I mean, at first, this was all new to GoPro. And at first people would be like, what is this? What are we talking about? But then eventually over time, in meetings and in conversations, again, instead of Tara and Brendan, now we're talking about the expressive adventurers and the dedicated capturers. And then we were writing that into our PRDs, and we're using that in meetings and conversations and presentations. It was great. Because now everyone at the company is aligned to a single set of how we talk about, who our customers are and what matters to them most. So here we have user testing. We've done some surveys. We had a great set of personas that we can use company-wide. It was an awesome start for us. However, we needed better visibility into what our customers actually were doing. Once they got the product in their hand, once they were using the apps, what are they doing? How are they using it? I mean, we couldn't answer so many questions because we didn't even know how they were interacting with the camera. So again, we were like, hey, we got to get more data. And again, for me, I was like, man, this is shocking coming from out. How do we get more data? How can we even measure anything if we don't have the data? So in parallel to that sort of effort of personas, we kicked off an effort around capturing data. It was a partnership between us and the hardware team, because we had to get it off the camera, but we had to store all that. We built up a team just for big data. We started to collect all this data. So we started with the camera. And this was the entry point, the funnel of like, hey, I start with capturing something. Well, then what happens downstream from there? Well, if we don't know what they do when they go to capture something, how can we inform anything that we do downstream? And at that time, GoPros had so many different modes. It's the settings and the modes and the combinations and permutations of all this stuff is enough to make anyone's head spin. And we wanted to understand, well, which ones do they use? How often do they use them? It doesn't matter to people. What if we get rid of some of these? Every time we would raise that question to anybody, oh, no, that's really important to someone. We can't get rid of that feature. We can't take that setting out. So we're like, no, we got to understand this. And we eventually, in 2014, every camera from that point forward was capturing every interaction, every mode button, every button press, everything that you did on the camera. And anytime that camera talked to our mobile app or to our desktop, or eventually when the camera could talk straight to the cloud, we would just send all that data up. And it was super valuable. And that gave us so many insights. But again, it was somewhat controversial because everyone loved the idea. I go into a meeting, I'm like, no, I use that mode all the time. What are you talking about? We can't get rid of that. Well, did you know that only 0.01% of our customers actually use that mode, and they only use it like once a month, if ever? Like and then at first everyone's like, no, there's no way. I don't believe it. That your data has to be wrong. There's no way that data's right. Come on, and we went back and we checked the data like 100 times. We went through it, made sure every aspect of the data was perfect. We had to do that because we had to convince people of this. The one thing that was actually the most shocking of all to everybody is everyone who was developing the cameras thought of it as a video camera. They were like, this is a video capture device. Well, it turns out that on certain models of our cameras, they were capturing way more photos than they were ever capturing video. And everyone's like, oh, that has to be a mistake. That can't be right. No, it's a video device. No. Well, I think we're like, well, it kind of makes sense because video is really hard to deal with after you've captured it. And if you captured 10 minutes, how are you going to edit that? That's really hard. Like, no wonder people just want to capture a photo. But again, it was very controversial. But then eventually, over time, even Nick would come into me. He's like, well, what does the data say? And that's when I was like, oh my God, we've won, we've got it. Like when he cares about the data, now we're getting somewhere. So at first, when I got there, we had some basic mobile app. We had a basic desktop application. Those weren't in much better shape in terms of data collection. So we sat down and we're like, let's start with mobile. We're going to start mobile first. Let's focus on that. We went through and instrumented everything in the mobile app, scoured through everything just to make sure that the data, again, was accurate and informing us in the right way, so that we can, again, start to backfill and inform what features are important to our customers, where to kind of guide our direction. And then rather than trying to fix the desktop app was so old that we're like, rather than trying to fix all that, let's just replace it with something much better. So we went and developed an entirely new desktop application, launched that with everything already instrumented. That way we can inform ourselves like where to go once we have that in place. So now we have user research, surveys, personas, and now lots and lots of data. So where else can we turn, to get feedback and input from our customers? So to pick on let's not leave the customer support team out. Actually, they became great partners for us down the road. I know I joked about it in the beginning, but eventually they're on the front line. They're the ones that hear from our most passionate customers. They're the ones that hear about these problems all the time. And so we found a way to really partner with these guys and get that direct feedback and instrument kind of the information they were gathering about the conversations they were having with the customers, so that we can start to understand better what was important. So then we got these regular weekly reports from them that would talk about, oh, this was the problems that customers are having. This is the biggest pain points. And they started sending this to us all the time, and it was super valuable, especially post-launch. Like once you've launched, you're like, hey, I really want to know what's going on. And then on top of that, we would ask them for recordings of the most painful phone calls. And tell me if you've ever sat through, I sat and listened to a 45-minute phone call once. I was like, wow. The customer support person was amazing. They were so, patient. But that really gives you an appreciation, some empathy for the person on the other end who's having a hard time. They're like, what is an SD card? Where does that go again? And I'm like, oh, wow, this is tough. But, hearing that as a product person, it helps you really understand who your customers are and gives you empathy for that. So we've had that, for the longest time, GoPro had that direct relationship with the athletes. And then they also had a beta program that they run through kind of like with early adopters of GoPro. But we didn't really have a lot of direct feedback. At least the product team never felt like we were getting that direct feedback from our customers. We felt like it was always filtered. And as a product person, I love to be as close to the customer as possible. So what we did is directly in the mobile app and the desktop application, we had a button that when someone clicks on that says, I have feedback or I have a problem, not only did it go to customer support, but it went straight to the product manager who was in charge of that product. And they got it directly every time. That way they're like feeling that every time someone's like, oh man, this was super frustrating, or even great ideas sometimes, because a lot of times your customers have some amazing ideas. They're like, well, did you ever think, and we got a lot of that, did you ever think about this? This would be awesome if I could do this. So that was super valuable to us as well. And so remember what I said at the beginning about getting outside? And we were, our team was super passionate about that. And I always believe it's a great way, again, to build empathy for your customers, understand, put yourself in their shoes. And so, especially as GoPro was going through this rapid growth from when I joined to 3 times that size in about a year, we had a lot of new employees, a lot of people that we wanted to help, understand the problems that our customers were dealing with and facing. So we went to Nick one time. We're like, Nick, you ever heard of the term eating your own dog food? He's like, what's that? And we're like, Nick, we want all our employees to know what it feels like to be a GoPro customer. And yeah, there were people that really were into GoPro, but not everybody. Sometimes, the engineers that never get a chance to take a break, coding all the time or something, we're like, we want them to feel that as well. Because when I go and explain a problem to them, I want them to feel that and understand it. And so we said, we want all our employees to have a chance to know what that feels like. And so soon after that, he came up with a program he calls Live It, Eat It, Love It. And he blocked out 2 hours on every Thursday, mandatory. You had to take a break, go outside, capture something that you love doing on a GoPro, and then share that out afterwards. It was mandatory. I mean, he made it like no meetings, not even for him. He's like, no meetings, nothing. Everyone gets this time off. You have to do it. And so it was like almost enforced, but it was great because at first people really embraced it, because they did it right after lunch. So you actually got 3 hours. And so people would be like, great, I get to go out and have a lot of fun, and then the requirement though was that whatever you did, you had to capture it on a GoPro and you had to share it out. And that's why they have the hashtag, GoPro Live It, because that's how we knew, oh, did you share those things out? Did you actually go through that? But that turned into, a great source of feedback for us as well. And to make sure that over time that we actually were capturing the feedback from in our internal teams, the people that were actually doing this, we made a special version of the app that if all you had to do was shake it, it immediately popped up a thing that you can give feedback, again, straight to the product manager for that app, and that way they knew, like if I had a problem in the middle of something, we wanted to hear about it. And so that turned into a really great program for us as well. So it really started after all of this, we were like, wow, we're making some great progress. So now I'd like to kind of walk you through, kind of the process that we would kind of go through with all of this feedback and input and research and stuff like that. So we would start, typically with a prioritized set of features and maybe some concepts, some bigger bets or something like that. And that's kind of where we would start, especially if it's a newer product or something new that we were launching. And from there, we would take those concepts into user research. We would prototype, paper prototypes, maybe some mock-ups or whatever it may be. We would prototype that as quickly as we could and get it in front of customers. We wanted to hear early on what their feedback was and what their thoughts were. And in some cases, eventually we had some really great prototypers that could literally bang out something that looked like a real app in like a day. And so then we could actually have something they can interact with and play with. And we would iterate on that, and keep going back and forth and get more feedback. Oh yeah, let's change that, let's try that, let's do that. And so that would be a process that we continue, and that would kind of feed in. Oh, this feature makes sense, that one doesn't, and kind of iterate back and forth. And then once we were confident with where we were headed, we would take that concept and the features and actually put it into the backlog for the actual release of product that would go out. And then again, once we have something that was developed to a point where we can put it in front of users, we would again go back. Like I said, we had those weekly people coming through. We would sit them down and have them play with stuff. We got so excited and passionate about this that we had a new office down in San Diego, And we built literally a dedicated user research lab just so that we could have people coming through and testing and recording and doing all that all the time. And then once we got that far enough along, GoPro had a set of like 5,000 beta testers that were always in this pool of users that were kind of the early adopters and super passionate about GoPro and loved to give us feedback. We had this pool of testers that we would then hand stuff to, whether it was the cameras or the apps or whatever, and we just like, here you go, play with it, and then get that feedback again. And that helped us catch the, the bigger bugs, issues, edge cases, things like that, that we could then go and fix. And then we would launch, and then once we released, we have all that data that we instrumented, we're capturing that, and that kind of feeds back into anything that we might want to do down the road in the future work. And then that customer support, after something's out there, you want to hear what, calls you're getting, what's going on. You want to hear about that immediately. You want to check in. Hey, are we doing okay? What's the biggest issues? Are we, launching there? And then longer term, because it was a quarterly basis that we would run these surveys, we would update the survey to match anything that we put out that was new to get that kind of feedback. And this was more long term, kind of, again, guidance in terms of motivations, what people were liking or not liking about the, the products. So I'd also like to run through just a quick mini example. Because we were focused a lot on mobile at the time, this kind of helps you see this in practice. So this is from one of those surveys. And we asked our customers, I think it's laser. So we asked our customers, hey, what do you think about, what do you use the most in the app? And they said, well, this is at a time when not all the cameras had a screen on the back, so they're like, oh, well, I use the mobile app to preview what I'm going to take a photo of. That's what everyone, they're like, hey, I use that the most. And then the next thing is, looking at what I captured. I want to review that, make sure do I want to keep it, do I want to use it? So that's all right, that's informative. But then when we actually looked at the data, not only on the app, but the camera as well, this media functions, that's actually someone reviewing stuff off the camera. The preview, that's that right there. They're actually not previewing stuff that often. They're actually, paying attention to what they've captured way more than, the preview. They're like going through it, checking it out, deleting it, maybe copying some things over to the phone. But we noticed that, man, they're doing a lot of the looking at it, but they're not copying stuff over very much. Well, why is that? Well, if you know how a lot of people tend to use GoPro, sometimes they turn it on, just leave it. 10 minutes of video later, you're like, oh man, what do I do? If you've ever tried to transfer 10 minutes of high fidelity GoPro video to a phone, you'll be sitting there for like a half hour, it'd take you forever. And we're like, well, that's kind of a problem. So we started to develop a hypothesis. We're like, we're trying to fix this problem of capture to share. Well, how do we do that? So we had a hypothesis. How do we, get people to copy stuff more? Well, what if instead of moving that entire 10-minute video, what if all you had to do is move the 15 seconds that you're going to share to Instagram and you're done? And we're like, well, what if we made that super easy for people to do? So we quickly, again, we made a prototype. We prototyped the idea of like, well, let me preview that video. And then if all I had to do is tap 15, it's going to grab just the 15 seconds of where I put my finger. And then it's just going to take that and transfer that to the phone. Even though the entire video may have been 10 minutes, all you had to do is transfer the 15 seconds. So it took like 15 seconds to transfer. And so we're like, we thought that was a pretty good idea. So we launched that. And we're like, man, people are going to love it because we tested it. We beta tested it. We went through all that testing. We're like, man, people are going to love it. Well, guess what? We're like, wow, the shares were for the next, right after we launched and even the month after that, I'm like, man, this is not what we were expecting. We're like, man, it's going to spike massive. We're going to have millions of shares. It's going to be awesome. People are going to love it. It's going to completely change the way people use the GoPro camera. And then we're like looking at this. We're like, no, there has to be something wrong. So we started digging into the data. We're like, look at this. Why are they not going? They're not going there. Something's not right. We started talking to people. We're talking to the customers. They're like, what are you talking about? What this trim and share thing? I don't even know what you're talking about. But that comes back to my last point about awareness. So we just didn't do a really good job at all. And GoPro at the time didn't market our software. They were really good at marketing the cameras through the video, but they didn't market the software. And so no one really knew it existed, and we ourselves, as the the product manager of the app, didn't do a good job. And so we're like, well, we got to fix that, And so we sent out a notification to everybody. We said, hey, by the way, did you know we have this really cool feature, and you might want to check it out? And just the notification, the month after that, bam, it jumped way up. And we're like, wow, that was awesome. Okay, that's great, but that still didn't hit our target. We're like, no, we know we can do way better, because I think at this time we probably had 20 million people using the app. We're like, no, we know people are sharing more than that. There has to be something wrong. And so what we did is we went back and said, well, what if we change, in this day and age, this is super common. We're like, well, if we make it obvious, because apps update in the background. When they go back into the app, if you don't let them know there's something new there, they won't even know it's there. And so we're like, well, we got to go fix that. So we went in, and so as soon as the app updates, it launched any new feature. We built a capability for any new features to be populated. And so it says, hey, by the way, there's a really cool feature. You might want to check it out. And then on top of that, we did a tooltip thing when you go into that particular area. Oh, by the way, there's this really cool feature. You just click here, and you can trim this thing and share it really fast. So we did that. We're like, and we tested it. We got good feedback. Oh, yeah, this looks like it's going to work. We did that. Bam, and it went up again. And now we're like, that's what we were really expecting after the initial launch. But it wasn't until we built that awareness and let people know that the feature was even there that it mattered. And that's when you really started to understand, like, man, if you don't build that awareness, people won't care, and they won't even bother to look at it. So kind of in summary, number one, get outside. Be an anthropologist. Put yourself in the shoes of your users, build that empathy. That's where you really discover these sort of latent needs and the real needs of what people care about, and not trying to drive technology, letting technology drive the decisions about what's next. And live it, eat it, love it. This is actually me there's this event in San Francisco called Bring Your Own Big Wheel. They take and block off the steepest hill in the middle of in the city and let people ride big wheels down it. And it's just the craziest thing you've ever seen. So I had to try that, and of course I had GoPros all over myself at the time. And then second, user testing. User testing, data, feedback. Go out, do some guerrilla research. Usertesting.com is actually an amazing website just to quickly test mobile apps, websites, things like that. They'll do more advanced stuff where they'll even interview people with video, and you can watch that while it's happening. It's actually pretty easy to use and set up. Surveys, and if you've never run a sprint, if you're not familiar with that, there's a book called Sprint. It's a great book. In a week, well, not even a week, in 5 days, it gives you a process in 5 days you can answer some very big questions, and I highly recommend it. It takes a lot of prep and stuff like that, but when you do it, you get a lot out of it. Because it includes prototyping, setting things up, going through a process of narrowing down what's important, bringing actual users in, running them through the whole process of testing and giving you feedback, all in a 5-day week. And I've used this at startups, and it's pretty amazing what you can get out of that. Most important, collect data. If you can't measure, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? If you don't know what's going on after you've launched something, how do you know if any of the things you're doing? If you set KPIs, how do you know that you've hit your KPIs, right? It's super important. And capture the feedback anywhere and everywhere you can from your customers, and listen to those customer calls. If you've never done that, if you work at a place where you can do that, I highly recommend it. It's amazing when you sit down and you listen to that. And talk to your care team, and then build awareness. Whether it's marketing, social, whatever it is in that case, but also in the apps, build all that out. Because if you don't do that in a way that will get your customers' attention, they won't even know you exist, or those great features that you spent and slaved over for many months maybe even exist. And it can be very frustrating when you launch and no one uses it. And lastly, hopefully next time I can talk a little more about the cool stuff I'm doing at T-Mobile. But what I can say is all this experience and stuff, we're building a pretty amazing team there. And we're starting to incorporate a lot of this kind of stuff at T-Mobile as well. And we're bringing more of that product management culture, product development, and kind of groundbreaking stuff. It feels a lot like a startup there, which is pretty exciting. And then, did I mention we're hiring? So if you're interested, don't hesitate to talk to me afterwards. And one thing I wanted to point out that we really do cool at T-Mobile is called this program called TOPS. And I mentioned customer care. Well, what these TOPS is a little bit like that. These are our frontline reps that work in our stores and are dealing with our customers every single day. We gather up a group of them, bring them to headquarters, and they sit side by side with the product team. And they're very familiar with all the challenges of selling products and the things that they hear from their customer base all the time. And our team gets a chance to hear that directly. And if we have questions, I mean, these reps are from all over the United States. And they're like, oh yeah, well, let me go talk to my friend that works in this store. We can get you that feedback really quick. So it's an amazing program, and it's been super valuable to the product team. So I just wanted to call that out. Thanks. And I'm open to any questions or answering. Yeah.
First of all, amazing talk. Thank you. My question is around, like, you were talking about the process, and in that first step was prioritize features and concept. So I was trying to understand that once you, for example, brainstorm a lot of ideas and you have a ton of features in your list, can you talk about more about how do you prioritize that? Do you include customers while prioritizing features as well, like creating wireframes and those kind of things?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the prioritization question is always a good one because it's never easy. You're always balancing, business priorities, what you think the customers are telling you, and that is a big influence to that. We had a lot of conversations at GoPro about how to go about doing that. We eventually tried to come up with a methodology that allowed us to sort of score features based on, and it was really that vision of like removing the friction. If that's our number one goal, because we felt that the more people share, the more other people are going to be aware and then eventually buy GoPros. So that was kind of anything that helped with that, removing that friction, that got a higher score. And obviously if we thought it was going to drive revenue in some way, that there's certain scoring. And so we would prioritize all our features against that. We would look at that and like, some things might really be, it would remove customer support issues and things like that, but maybe it didn't do anything else. And so, but having some sort of scoring mechanism, it allowed even new product managers who just came in, we're like, hey, here's how kind of we start, and obviously there's other influences often, there's still the hippo sometimes, but, but that helps, at least give you a starting point of where you think certain features, sit in the stack rank. But that's usually how you have to look at what's important to the company, what's important to the business, what's important to your customers, and you have to balance those in some way. Yeah.
Big fan of T-Mobile and John.
Thanks.
And this is a great presentation. As you were talking, that question would pop up in my mind, and then a couple of slides later, you got answered it. Just technically not a question. You mentioned about the copy feature, right? Copying the video to internet. And you probably were brainstorming. Someone would have came up with the idea of why can't we reduce it to 15 seconds? Can you give me more insights on what led to that point from the moment that you captured the data?
What led to the idea of taking the clip?
Yeah.
I mean, it was a little bit of conversation because we would involve engineering in some of those brainstorming, sessions and stuff like that. And in some cases, you don't even know if it's technically possible, right, to do certain things. And so we were thinking about, again, you capture 10 minutes of video. Well, how do you shrink that down? And there's lots of ways to do that, and you talk to the engineering team. Well, one guy's like, well, we can compress it, make it really small. Maybe that's one way of doing it. And we're like, well, yeah, well, what does that look like? How long would that take? Or, how technically possible is that? And you kind of get that input on that. And then someone else is like, well, I have this other idea. Well, is that possible? Is it even feasible to build that sort of thing? And so we would partner with our engineering teams, as we're brainstorming about these sorts of things to see, because it's always that balance, right? Again, of what's feasible, and how long will it take to get the feature out there, and things like that. So actually it turned out part of what was driving that decision is like some engineer was like, you know what? I think I figured out a way to do it, and I could probably write that in a day and it'll work. He literally wrote a prototype and came back and said, "Oh, check this out, it works." And I'm like, we're all like, "What?" Wow, that's amazing. So I mean, a lot of it is like, that kind of influence of partnering with your engineering team on those types of things that help drive sort of how you arrive at certain solutions. And that's really where that came from, is like what was most feasible in the shortest amount of time. It really did address a key pain point of, like, everyone knew moving video that's 10 minutes long just took way too long, and so they would never do it. And we heard from our customers a lot that they would go out. I mean, this is a common phrase. I bought the GoPro because I was going on my wedding or honeymoon or vacation to Hawaii, and so I wanted a waterproof camera, so I bought the GoPro and I took all this video over 2 weeks. I've never offloaded it off the camera. I've never done anything with it. Sits in a drawer now, collecting dust. And we're like, man, that's not what, it was painful to hear that every time. Yep.
I think you moved from consumer hardware companies, like mostly in the media sector. So does your experience either in the domain itself, or in technical expertise help in the product manager role that you had, say, GoPro?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's unique in my background is I've dealt with like consumer hardware a lot, and that I've kind of tended to stay in that domain, in that area. And it's, I started out in laptops and then eventually moved to more media streaming devices and things like that. I mean, there's a few jobs I didn't even put up there. And then, Amazon, streaming devices again. But then, I always stay somewhere in that sort of space. Eventually, the last job I had before T-Mobile was autonomous delivery robots. So very different than anything I've done before, but it was still a piece of hardware, and an experience that went with that. And so I tend to stay in that domain, and that has helped because I think that's somewhat unique. It's different than mobile apps and websites and things like that. There's unique sets of challenges that I think I've built up, expertise in over the years.
And my question is more around, like, for this particular role and the challenges at GoPro, like, was that background very relevant?
Yeah, actually, because even though that in that particular role I was focused more on the software side of it, having a deep understanding of the hardware and how the interactions with hardware made a huge difference. Because and this is true even at T-Mobile where I am now today. IoT devices which we're working on, it's not just the device, it's an entire end-to-end experience, right? And so there's usually an app and other things that go with that experience. Hardware is a part of that, but you can't ignore that piece of hardware. There's the communication and connections between them that, if you do it right, it's kind of magical, right? People are like, wow, how did that happen? These things. That's the part that you have to understand that helps. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk, very, very thought-provoking. My name's Allison. I work as a product manager for a company called SnapRaise. And I'm curious to learn a little bit more about what you described with the prototyping process. So it sounds like that was really ingrained in your process, and prototyping, getting things out in front of users, getting feedback. Did you always do that in person with your users, like watch them interact with it, or did you incorporate some A/B testing?
Yeah,
I'd love to hear that, because I think I want to know about whether or not you release things to beta without the prototyping phase. How that went. Maybe that was like we don't do that.
No, I mean, it depends on the level of feature and that in particular. Like if it's a smaller feature, we may not entirely prototype that. And we did run A/B tests, a lot of times when we're doing certain things. When I first got the mobile app, and none of our apps and website had that capability built in, we eventually did that so that we can start to run A/B testing. And that was great for the smaller, minor changes, where we didn't feel like building a whole prototype. But if anytime we did a pretty big feature like that trim and share thing, we would want to prototype that, because there is amount of investment, in going off and building it, and really productizing it. And so it's much cheaper always to prototype and get it in front of users, get feedback. Are we even in the right direction or the right path? And this is even more so true in the context of hardware and devices. Those get very expensive very fast. And prototyping and doing as much of that up front, I love building stuff. And so we at T-Mobile, first thing we got was a 3D printer and a laser cutter and a bunch of stuff like that, because we're like, we got to be able to prototype. We got to be able to build things and put it in front of people so that they can touch and feel it, give us feedback on it before I go spend millions of dollars to build the real thing. And so that's why I've been a big believer in prototyping. It saves a lot of time up front, and avoids sometimes costly mistakes later. Sure. Yep.
I have a question. So how do you handle that feature that are country specific? So Europe has a certain privacy law that is different than the US. Does that process go separately? And if you could explain to us how that works.
Yeah, that.
We're collecting data about this call to know that the video was used for a certain percentage or what's not. That technically might not be, applicable
right.
in a region. So.
Yeah, so obviously we always had our legal team involved in anything that we were doing, and so they have to give us input on, hey, we're going to launch this, all over the world. What does that mean? What are the implications of that? Do we have to isolate things in different ways? We actually did have to do some of that, like how you store data, how you isolate it, how long can you keep it? All of those types of things came into play when we started thinking about that and rolling that out. And then there's always there's challenges with, like, how do you make sure that they've accepted the terms of service, that go along with us, being able to collect the data and stuff like that. And so all of those things had to be incorporated into the process as well when you roll out features that are going to impact, different regions of the world. So, yeah, I wanted to get you had a question before.
I have two questions actually.
Okay.
The first question, well, when you create personas for the product, for the GoPro in this particular case, I believe you consider also the not only United States market but everything else. And when I traveled recently in Europe, I noticed that there is not so many people who use GoPro. And well, we saw for 2 months we saw 3 people with GoPro. They were all from California. Do you think it could be, and when it comes to the customer awareness, do you think that maybe marketing or product team didn't do a great job with try to make the product more with this awareness thing, and that's why it's not that popular, for example, in Europe, or there was an issue with considering which personas and the demographic thing?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't think we probably did at the time an amazing job of, when we created the personas, thinking about is that persona exactly the same everywhere in the world? And that's true. I think of U.S.-based companies. They have a tendency to think about the U.S. market more than other places. But we did have offices, and they had an office in Munich and some other places in Europe. But we didn't. I don't think that influenced enough some of those, and how we would do things different in terms of marketing in those other parts of the world. So I don't know. And even today, this data in the conversation around GoPro is a little bit dated. Today they're not quite what they used to be. And I think that's just more of a broader market shift of where things have gone.
Okay, and I also have one more question. When you build the persona for the product, when it comes to the product you sell for a particular customer, for example, it's like some ERP system for the particular company, you can like concentrate on the roles, which kind of like helps and to create those personas. And when it comes to the more wider auditory, any advices or tips how to take into account what you really want to see kind of like in these personas, and how to avoid situations that you create a lot of personas and you can kind of like spread and create some useless features which is not really applicable for the product you create. How to kind of create the right personas without this extra.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be somewhat careful, because if you're not, I've seen where people go off and create a lot of personas, and that's not, then it becomes not very useful. It's hard to make decisions because you're trying to pick which ones do I use. I think I'm not an expert in creating personas per se, but definitely what I've seen is that you have to look at them in a way that allows you to, I mean, 5 is probably the max of what I think is what you want. You know, and if you can go with less, that's even better. But it's really around motivations and the way people think about the product, as opposed to, a lot of people get confused with segmentation and demographics as being a persona, which is not necessarily accurate, you know, because you get too hung up on how old they are, or is it a male or a female or a family or kids, and as opposed to like, what are the real motivations that drive their decisions that will lead to certain outcomes? And that, looking at it that way, you know, helps you avoid, you know, trying to segment things too narrowly and then end up with a lot of personas. And then sometimes you may create a set of personas that are for a specific niche, or like, you know, maybe commercial, or, you know, in the commercial business or the B2B side of businesses, maybe you're looking at a certain niche of your business or an area of your business that needs its own set of personas that are independent of other areas. It depends on how you've structured, how that company is structured. Honestly, I've never been on the B2B side of things, so it's, you know, I don't know exactly how they look at all their customers, because sometimes they have very big customers that they probably treat very differently than someone who's trying to address it for a broader market. So,
just to clarify for myself, your advice here to be more concentrate on the persona motivation and basically what drives them to use your product.
Yeah, I mean, usually customers are looking for a particular outcome, a goal. They have a goal in mind, and they're like, how do I get to that outcome? And what motivates them? You know, like, do they care about the fact that, you know, I mean, because a lot of times you see these makeups of personas sometimes, and they have like you know, I have 2 kids and a dog. Well, does that matter in the context of the product that that you're selling to them? If it doesn't, then why even bother incorporating that into the persona? Focus more on the fact that I'm trying to accomplish, the customer is trying to accomplish some goal, and they're trying to achieve some outcome. What motivates them to use your product or use features of your product over other things, you know, or other options that may exist in the market? And as opposed to, I think some people just get too hung up on some of the other pieces of the sort of tangible pieces of a persona, of like, you know, age and you know, they're a millennial and they do these things. That's not necessarily what's important. It's, you know, the things that motivate them. You know, I care about being home, you know, or I care about being outdoors. I want to, you know, relax outside. You know, those are the things that, you know, they care about. You know, and there's going to be certain motivations they have when they do that. I want everything to be quiet, or I want to, you know, I want to be able to listen to, you know, something, or I want to be able to do something when I'm outside. What, you know, why is that? What motivates them to feel that way? You know, try to understand that better than they're 25 and, you know. So that's the way we, and it's a craft. I mean, not everybody is good at creating personas, and we work, you know, we would work with people who are good at that, and that helps, you know, as opposed to, and I've met people that are really good at it, and other people are, like they say, they treat it more like a demographic as opposed to a real persona.
I'm curious because obviously T-Mobile is a really innovative place, and so when you joined them 10 months ago, was there anything that you were surprised that they weren't doing or hadn't started doing by the time you got there? Do you have a lot of experience and you come from a lot of background, and I'm wondering if there was anything where you were taken aback when you joined them?
That's a good question. Yeah, no, I mean, especially since I came from a startup, and you know, to a bigger company, for me there was some things that were like, wow, this. I mean, there's things I expected. You know, I've worked at big companies before, but then I think from a certain product management sort of discipline point of view, they were, you know, and not to pick on, you know, T-Mobile is what drives them is more like rate plans and, you know, campaigns around those things they're selling in the stores, and most of what they sell are, you know, a phone from LG or Samsung or something like that. So how they approach product, because they were like, hey, this is our product, and they're like, well, they describe product as a rate plan, you know, and I'm like, well, that's not how I think of product. And that was the thing that was more, you know, everyone was saying, I'm a product manager, and when they describe what they're product managing, it's very different than what I'm thinking of as product management. I think of product management as like physical products that I develop, or even mobile apps, or, you know, things like, or experiences, you know, entire end-to-end experiences and stuff like that. To me, that was sort of like interesting. You know, I got there and everyone's talking about the products, and when they're talking about products, it's very different than the product. And I'm thinking of, you know, oh, what are you working on? What are you developing? And they're like, well, we're gonna do a $5 rate plan with this campaign. And I'm like, wait, no, that's not what I'm imagining. So that's just different, you know, because of, yeah. And I think our group in particular has built up a team that, you know, was very tiny and kind of nascent in the beginning, and, you know, myself and some of the other people that have come into the team, we all come from similar types of true product, you know, when I think of true product, like product development, you know, product management backgrounds, and we're building up a team now that is developing end-to-end product experiences, right? You know, we're not just, it's not even just a mobile app in some cases, it's like, no, we're doing every aspect of the product. The hardware, the software, the cloud service, you know, all of those, and we think about how that, you know, is going to impact our customers and the customer experience, and that is now starting to permeate, you know, and we're trying to, you know, build more of that, and that's why we're trying to hire as fast as we can. We're like, come on, we need more, because we're growing, and the roadmap of stuff we're doing is constantly growing. Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked about measuring success at some point in the presentation. And I'd just like to know more about how you measure success when you build some of these products, and how that ties into the bottom line, and if you kind of have challenges, you know, building certain features that you can't necessarily, you know, measure the direct impact on, you know, your profit and loss, and how you kind of worked around that.
Yeah, I mean, we would always try to set, and this is a practice that I think is not always incorporated in a product management process. A lot of times this is something that happens after the fact. Like, hey, we launched, oh yeah, we need to measure that and figure out how well it's doing. As opposed to up front saying, you know, within our funnel, we want to capture out of this many people that we, you know, based on what we know about our customers and what they're doing today, we think if we launch this feature, we're going to set a target of like, it's going to drive engagement by X, or it's going to drive attachment or new customers, or if there is a revenue component of that, how much is it going to drive revenue? Is it going to lift, you know, sales of the camera? Is it going to drive more shares, which we then could translate somehow to sales of cameras? We would set those up front, you know, and you have to set those KPIs up front, because then it keeps you disciplined as you're developing the product, that you don't start throwing in extraneous features and things like that. It helps you prioritize features of what is the most important. And you don't want necessarily those really important KPIs, you don't want too many of them, because then you don't know which one was the thing that really mattered. It's like, hey, here's one or two that we really, really care about, and that's going to hit the bottom line because of revenue, or it's going to drive, you know, some other outcome that is important to us, particular in that quarter or maybe for the year. And once you've set that, then you're like, we got to make sure we measure that, because sometimes you're in you're developing so fast that the engineer's like, I don't have time to instrument that. You know, like, okay, we won't. That one doesn't matter as much right now, but we got to instrument this path because that's super important to us measuring the outcome. And so it helps those conversations if you do that up front as opposed to after the fact, because it sucks when you've launched and then you're like, did we instrument that? And they're like, oh, we missed that one thing and now we don't know. And you're like, ugh, because you missed that really critical time of right after you launch, what happened. And so, you know, I think it's important to set those KPIs early, you know, up front. And usually that's driven by maybe a broader vision of the company and the goals and outcomes that you're trying to achieve for that year. You take those in and you say, well, what is important for us then? You know, what is the outcomes that we care about? Yeah.
You mentioned roadmaps. So how deep is your product roadmap? Do you keep it only to a certain time frame because you feel like beyond that, you know, product in general is evolving so much that the roadmap beyond a certain point becomes stale? What's that happy medium of how deep your roadmap is?
Yeah, and this is another area that is somewhat unique when you talk about companies that do hardware. In the world of mobile apps and websites and services and things like that, things evolve super fast, right? Like you're working in 2-week sprints and you get updates to mobile apps every 2 weeks, and you know it's hard to have a roadmap that looks 3 years out, you know, because in 3 years, who knows what's going to happen, right? But I think it's important to have some sort of like big sort of milestones that you want to get to. But in the world of hardware, like it takes 24 months sometimes to ship a piece of hardware. So you have to plan farther out. And actually the most challenging issue that we had at GoPro was, so the camera team plans 2 years ahead at a minimum, usually 3 or more. The teams that's doing software is like, you know, like we're just cranking along. But how do you align the two? Like this camera's gonna drop, you know, at Christmas holiday time frame. You know, how do we make sure that all these features that we're working on here eventually line up with the thing that really matter for that camera? That's super challenging, right? You know, because you're on a very different cycle and pace and things like that, you know, and how do you make sure those align? And that was always a struggle for us, you know, and I don't think I've ever worked at a company where that's been easy, you know, where you align software teams that are working agile and moving very fast and hardware teams that are, you know, on this completely different trajectory of, hey, a year and a half from now, we're going to drop something. You know, you don't even often know what that is until you get closer to it, you know. But, I mean, you know, there's different ways to sort that out, but it's not easy. But that's why I think having some roadmap that either is milestone based, you know, on the software side, so that it's like, hey, we have this milestone of we want enough of these features in place, and sometimes we would hold the features and wait. You know, we're like build, but don't launch because we want those features to launch with this because we're going to go big. You know, but you build towards that, and that's one approach. Yeah.
Question about you know, just the culture of analytics and gathering insights. Sounds like on the software side you had success there, but any experience or insights into putting something like that in place inside of a bigger organization or even a smaller organization where you don't have that culture where people are either budget constrained or feel like they have enough feedback. You know, it's often challenging in bigger environments to go off and do a deal with user testing or Alteryx or whoever it might be, or human factors lab.
Yeah, I think you have to get small wins, you know, and show success in some ways. You know, it's not like all of a sudden one day you can just drop, you know, all of that on. I mean, and the data, like the data project we did at GoPro, it was a 1.5 year effort. You know, like to get all that to finally be in a place where it was, you know, super valuable. So before that, to commit, you know, even if you have someone who's somewhat of a proponent for it, like I said, most of the people were against the idea because I think they knew if the data proved them wrong in terms of the conversations they used to have, they didn't want it, right? And so, but we did have to show some sort of small wins with doing this in other places, you know, and even if it's begging and pleading, for enough money or enough time from a developer to, build something, and then show that outcome of that had value. And that's kind of how we started with the user testing and stuff. I mean, we were being like very guerrilla about it in terms of like whatever, because we didn't have a big budget at first, so we had to like collect data any way we can, and then show that the outcomes of what we learned were driving success or improvements, and then once we showed enough of that, then people were like, oh, well, why don't you do more of that? Well, if we had more money, maybe we, but it had to be, I mean, what I showed here made it sound like it happened overnight. I was there for 3 years, and it wasn't until almost the 3rd year that, we really kind of started to see more success with this.
One more follow-up then. Do you like to have, once you start getting data, do you like to have the rigor around, let's say, creating new user stories or priorities and saying that you have to have data to back it up? Otherwise, I'm not going to do it.
Well, and I think, yeah, we had a challenge at first of getting developers to even bother to put the instrumentation in, It would always be the last thing they would think about, and that's why in some cases we end up at the end and we're like, did we instrument that? Oh no. And so, but I think what helped with that over time is that if you make the data in their face, like the data you are collecting, if it's just some dashboard that only one product manager is ever looking at and not sharing it back out to anybody and making everyone aware of what's going on, then they won't care, right? And so eventually you put up dashboards everywhere, you have, sessions where you're sharing with the engineering team, hey, this is what's going on from what we do know from the data we have collected, this is what's going on. How do we make this better? How do we improve the thing? And it's not just about building the feature. We want to show that the feature you built, actually worked. And the more we shared back out, the more people wanted to pay attention to the data, and then they would start to build it, right? But when it was like just the product manager looking at his own screen all the time, just saying, hey, this isn't working because the data says it's not working, no one else saw it, right? And so then no one cared. So that part of it became really important, that share back out piece of that. Yeah.
What is your best day at work as a product manager? When you're thinking, man, I can't believe they paid me to do this.
Yeah, I mean, usually the best day is when you've launched something and the problem you thought you were going to solve, customers talk about it, and you read that and you're just like, wow, that moment is usually the best day, when I'm like, I'm super excited to be here, I'm super excited about my job. And sometimes it takes a long time to get, I think that's what makes that moment so fulfilling, is that all the work and effort you put in, especially if you're like me who's worked on hardware products where 2 years later you finally have launched and then you see it in people's hands and people are like, this is amazing, this is the best, that's usually like, wow, that's
the best day you cry at work.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a question about building awareness at TiVo in a particularly fragmented marketplace. When the media is very fragmented, how do you get your message out there and make it consistent so products and services stay visible on a regular basis?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in marketing, but I think that repetition of like how you talk about your products and how you message them, being consistent about that, and then reiterating that over and over. And I think at T-Mobile, what we found is that our frontline team, that's another reason that tops, bringing them to us is super valuable, because then eventually they're going to go back and they're going to be the people in the stores talking to our customers about the products. And the more they understand that product and the more they know how to message that product and reiterate the important value that you're bringing, that's super important, right? Where I've seen things break down is like the marketing message that you see on a TV or in other places is not the same that the guy in the store is saying, then there's a breakdown. Because like the customer is like, I see that, and they're like, oh wow, that's super cool. I'm gonna go to a store. They talk to some rep or they talk to someone in the store, and they're describing it in a completely different way. They're like, oh, wait, what is this again? What am I buying? You know, I think throughout the whole chain of like touch points for the customer, being, you know, making sure that your message is consistent all the way through and reiterating that over and over, I think is super important. And I think that's the thing that I was excited to, you know, at T-Mobile, because everyone talks about how amazing our front line is in terms of the salespeople and the stores and all that. I think they tend to do a really good job. They want to learn about the products. They want to understand them well. They want to, like, you know how to sell it. And I'm excited, you know, to once we can bring our products there. I'm super excited about that. Because I've never worked in a place where we actually own our own stores. You know, it's always like, you know, I've worked at places where we give our product to a Best Buy or we give our product to somewhere else and then hope that they know how to sell it, right? You don't have that, you know, end-to-end kind of control over that experience.
In a way, that's a huge advantage to you. You know, if you want to do a test market, you just go to the stores and maybe just observe people very quickly, just gather data.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, and we've talked about using our stores in a way of like piloting ideas where rather than launching a full-blown product to, you know, our 5,500 stores that we have out there, you know, taking a few, you know, of our key stores and saying, hey, let's just test an idea with a product that, you know, is kind of beta maybe, but just to get feedback from customers just to see what they say. We have the advantage of being able to do that in the store because we own the stores, you know. And that's something that's unique to T-Mobile that I don't think I've seen in other places.
Yeah, I would just like to add, like, I work at Microsoft, like, we do that all the time, like, piloting in the store. It's such a fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, as a product manager, if I want to develop some new features, then I have one thing called user data. So I'm understanding the customer's perspective and his pain points. But at the same time, I want to develop some new features into the product. So what should be the balance like? And if say I want to have new features, then how would I convince my product team that we have to solve the pain points of the customer, but at the same time we also have to develop some new features. So we are up there, in the competition, or we are providing something new, fun and cool. So how do we balance that?
So just to qualify the two different types of features that you're talking about, are you saying the new feature isn't something that your customers have thought of or are giving you feedback on, or you're saying that it's something that
customer may not even have thought about it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I would still somewhat say that, you know, even if it's a brand new feature that your customers haven't thought of, it still should be adding value to your customers, and it should come from insights that you've gathered or understood about your customers, right? I mean, there's this phrase that you hear all the time, like, you know, Steve Jobs said it, Ford said it, you know, about like if I asked people what, you know, if they wanted a car, they would tell me a faster horse kind of thing. Like, it doesn't mean you don't talk to your customers and understand, you know, their needs. It just means a lot of times they don't understand what could be in terms of the technology or how to, you know, the solution side of it. But I still believe that you want to understand your customers well enough to know what is most important to them. And it may not always come from asking them. A lot of times I learn a lot just from literally sitting and watching people. You know, because I've been in situations so much where you ask a customer, and it was funny because when, you know, a good example from the GoPro days, we would bring people in, and most people have this tendency not to want to tell you something negative about. Some people love it, you know, some people don't. And so we sit them down, and it took them 5 minutes. They literally stared at a screen for 5 minutes not knowing what to do. And then when you bring them in and you ask them, well, how did it go? They're like, oh, it was super easy. And we're like, really? Like, you literally stared at the same screen for 5 minutes not knowing what to do. And they're like, yeah, you had to push them on that. Because if you just come out and ask, they're like, oh yeah, no problems at all. And we're like, well, what about that screen that, you know, it looked like you struggled with? Oh, and then they would kind of open up and they would be like, well, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to click on this thing or that. But that's why in some ways surveys aren't enough. You have to really understand how people use things and do things in their environment, right? And so those insights, I think, should drive those new features, as opposed to just, I have an idea for something. You know, I always feel like you should be adding value in some way. And those should come from some understanding of your customers and making sure that you're developing things that are solving real problems, as opposed to, hey, I have this really cool thing I want to do because the technology lets me do it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would your decision on the question she asked be based on the product's life cycle? For example, if the pain point for the customer is in a product that has reached the maturity stage or a sunset stage of this product life cycle, then would you rather focus on the next big thing out there than, say, necessarily
going back and can, yeah, that's a question you have to answer in terms of, like, you know, where that product is at in its life. You know, does it make sense to keep adding, you know, or fixing or adjusting? And, you know, sometimes that's easy in the hardware world because hardware goes stale, it gets old, the processor's too slow now, you want to do something different. You know, you've upgraded to a point where you're like, look, I don't want to go back and try to make that work on this old piece of hardware. In the software world, I think it's a tougher decision sometimes because you have like some application or something that's been out there for a long time, but it's kind of reached, you know, a certain point. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's like, like we did that actually at GoPro as well. We had this old version of the desktop app, and we were debating, should we go back and try to fix that? Or should we just leave it and then completely start over? You know, and we just knew that we would never take that one to the ultimate end goal or a goal that we had in mind, because the amount of work it would take to do that wasn't worth it. We would rather start from scratch. And so we just sunset that one and started over. And, you know, sometimes those are tough decisions dependent, but it does depend on where your bigger vision is or where you want to get to. That help drive, you know, that. It's never easy though, because if you have a decent sized customer base, you know, using something, it's not always an easy decision.
I've tried following customer service agents at our company, and you feel terrible listening to people complaining that they're not able to do something on IE 8 or 9, and then you have to, you know, it's like, do we really want to focus on somebody using such an outdated browser? Or, you know, if they've been a loyal customer, do you really want to? Yeah,
I mean, that's where you know, we've had that debate before as well, as, you know, especially on a website that is an e-commerce driven website, you know, and they're like, I'm losing sales because something doesn't work on some super old browser, and you're like, well, how much sales are you? That's where the other side of the data really comes into play. Yes, you'll hear about the super loud minority sometimes, and that's usually the people that call customer support, but you got to have the other side of the data. You know, because you can't just listen to them and be like, oh, we got to go fix this and make it work on IE7. You know, when you actually go look at the other side of the data, it's like, well, that's like 0.5% of our actual users, right? You know, it's like, does it make sense? Is it worth it? You know?
It's an uncomfortable conversation. I had to show operations that, I mean, as much as those members are the ones calling in and they've been loyal members, you know, less than 1%. As terrible as it is, I have to say I really don't care at this point. And, yeah.
Well, and that's where you give them a trade-off, right? Like if you're like, hey, do you want me to fix that, or do you want me to fix something else that maybe has a bigger impact to everybody's business, or, you know, and if you give them that, then they're like, oh, well, yeah, I'll take that one instead. This other one, maybe we don't need that. Cool.
Any other questions?
Probably one.
Okay.
So there was a great question about your best day, but what about the worst day? You can share lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the toughest, and it's probably never easy, but the toughest when I did my own startup, you know, and you invest, if you've ever done your own startup before, you invest so much of your own personal time, and like you live and breathe that. And then, you know, at some point it just doesn't work out, right? And it's when you have to make that final decision, like, okay, we got to shut the thing down. I got to lay everybody off. I got to, like, that's painful, you know. And that was probably the most painful, you know, moment, you know, going through that. And I'm like, yeah, I really don't want to do that again. But it's a big learning, you know. Like you learn a lot from that one in particular. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.